My name is Joe, and today is the 12th of May. It's a Tuesday, and I am heading towards Lincoln Castle. Geographically, it's the closest castle to where I live. I've lived in the area for 40 years, and I've never ever been. It's always been on my bucket list, but for some reason, just never been there. Been to Lincoln many times, and never have been around the cathedral, never been around the castle. I'm going to film the whole thing and then share it with you. Hope you enjoy. Lincoln is one of those places where you can almost walk through 1,000 years of English history in under an hour. One of the best things about Lincoln Castle is how layered it feels. You're never just looking at one period of history. From here, you can see the magnificent Lincoln Cathedral dominating the skyline. For a time, this was one of the tallest buildings in the world. Castle and cathedral sitting side by side. Military power and religious power, both occupying the highest ground in the city. Both designed to dominate the landscape physically and psychologically. Everything about this hill was intentional. The Romans used it for strategic defence, the Normans used it for conquest and control. Later, kings used it for administration, imprisonment and justice. And today, it survives as this strange architectural time capsule. A place where Roman urban planning, Norman military engineering, medieval law and modern tourism all overlap. That's what makes Lincoln Castle more interesting than many castles that are simply beautiful ruins. This place wasn't just decorative or defensive. It was politically significant, legally significant, strategically significant. It mattered, and arguably in some ways still does. Because when people visit here today, whether they realise it or not, they're walking through ideas that shaped Britain itself: infrastructure, conquest, law, authority, resistance, and the long process of defining who actually holds power, all contained within these walls. So next time you look at Lincoln Castle, don't just see a medieval tourist attraction. See a Roman military site, a Norman power statement, a legal landmark, and one of the few places you can physically trace almost 2,000 years of history by simply walking around. Standing here on these walls, you're not just looking at a medieval castle, you're standing on a site that was strategically important long before the Normans ever arrived. The story really begins with the Romans. The Romans invaded Britain in 43 AD, and while they're famous for military conquest, one of the things they arguably did even better was infrastructure. Wherever the Romans went, roads followed. Not because they were trying to make life easier for holidaymakers nearly 2,000 years later, but because roads meant speed, efficiency, and control. Roman roads were designed primarily for military logistics, moving troops quickly, transporting supplies, and reinforcing frontier positions when needed. And the Romans had very simple philosophy when it came to roads. If possible, make them straight. The shortest route between 2 points is a straight line, and Roman engineers embraced that idea with ruthless practicality. One of the most important roads they built running north was Ermine Street. This road connected London to the north and effectively acted as a military artery through Roman Britain. As Roman forces pushed further north, roads like this extended behind them, creating a logistical backbone for the empire. Another major Roman road was Fosse Way. Its name likely comes from the Latin word fossa, meaning ditch, because parts of the route was associated with defensive ditches or boundaries. Fosse Way ran diagonally across Roman Britain, and for a time roughly marked the frontier of Roman-controlled territory. Where these two major roads intersected, the Romans recognised as an obvious strategic opportunity, and that is why this hill became important. This location became Lindum. Originally, this site began as an auxiliary fort around the late 40s AD, Later, by roughly 60 AD, it was expanded into a large legionary fortress. By 70 AD, once Roman control had stabilised further north and the frontier had moved on, the military installation became less critical and the settlement transitioned into a colony. A Roman colony was essentially a settlement for retired soldiers and Roman citizens, so Lincoln transformed from a military outpost into a proper Roman town. That's actually where the city's name comes from, Lincoln. It evolved from Lindum Colonia, over centuries of linguistic erosion. Even today, if you walked around Lincoln, you're still following the Roman logic of the city. The uphill and downhill divide reflects the original Roman settlement on this elevated ground, and elevation mattered. High ground gives visibility, defensibility, and symbolic power. The Romans knew it, and 1,000 years later, so did the Normans. Fast forward to 1066. England has just been conquered by William the Conqueror. The Normans were experts at consolidating power quickly. Their solution was simple: build castles everywhere. Not grand stone castles immediately, but something much faster. Motte and bailey castles. Lincoln Castle began life as one of these. A motte and bailey castle was essentially a rapid deployment military fortification. The motte was the large earth mound, usually topped with a timber keep or tower. The bailey was the enclosed courtyard below, protected by palisades, ditches, and earthworks. These castles could be built relatively quickly, often within weeks, and served one critical purpose: control. This wasn't just about defence from foreign enemies, it was about controlling the local population after conquest. Castles were physical statements of power, a message in architecture that basically said, "We're here now." Lincoln was especially important because of its position controlling major routes and the existing Roman fortifications. The Normans actually built Lincoln Castle partly over the remains of the Roman walls. That's one of the fascinating things about this site. Each civilization didn't start from scratch. They inherited strategic logic from whoever came before. Romans chose the hill, Normans reused it, and medieval kings continued investing in it. Over time, the original timber structures were replaced with stone. What began as a practical Norman fortification evolved into the more recognisably medieval castle you see today. But Lincoln Castle isn't just about military history. It also became deeply tied to law, governance, and the development of the constitutional rights in England. And that brings us to perhaps the castle's most famous treasure, the Magna Carta. In 1215, a group of rebel barons forced King John to agree to a charter limiting royal authority. At the time, this wasn't some grand declaration of universal human rights. It was far more practical and political. The barons were effectively saying, the king cannot simply do whatever he wants. He cannot arbitrarily seize property, impose punishments, or ignore established legal processes. Magna Carta introduced the radical idea that even the monarch is subject to law. That concept sounds obvious today, but at the time, it was revolutionary. Its most famous legacy is the principle of due process, the idea that legal punishment should follow lawful judgment, not simply the whims of power. The idea that legal punishment should follow lawful judgment, not simply the whims of power. Over the centuries, Magna Carta became hugely symbolic. Its influence can be traced into English common law, parliamentary development, the American Constitution, and many later legal traditions. Lincoln Castle holds one of only 4 surviving original 1215 Magna Carta copies. That alone makes this place historically extraordinary. 1 of 4, and it's still here, on display inside the castle vault. Photography isn't allowed, which honestly adds to the atmosphere a bit. No phones, no quick snapshots. You actually have to stand there in darkness and look at it. And when you do, it's surprisingly humbling. A relatively small piece of parchment, but one whose symbolic influence became enormous.